Thanks, Ben. It's good to see you, or probably helpfully for some for us how we might feel tonight, to not to be seen to some degree. Ben and I have been chatting about part of this series for a long time. I'm actually really excited for it because I think it's incredibly important for everybody to keep evaluating what you believe and understand, but also incredibly important to challenge yourself and to continue to have a posture of wanting to learn all the time. The title for tonight's message is Inclusion, Exclusion, Gender, Sexuality and Judgment. Inclusion, exclusion, gender, sexuality and judgment. And you can tell by that title that there's no chance that I'm going to get through everything that I might want to get through in one particular occasion. And maybe even as you heard that, your ears pricked up a notch or two. They probably did so for one of the following reasons. Well, that's not a topic that I normally hear spoken about in a church. That's a controversial topic, Andrew, a dangerous topic, because so many people have ideas about where and what this is, and it's really important to them. That's a topic that's important because I have a friend who feels like that, somewhere in that space. That's a topic because maybe I feel like I'm in that space. And I know that inclusion and that idea of inclusion is seen as kind of almost like a fundamental value in our world today, and much higher than any previous generation. To exclude someone or to give the impression of excluding someone is seen as blatantly wrong and at all costs needs to be avoided. I want to say to people tonight that I don't believe that I can, and anybody, is it possible to cover everything in this topic. It's a very kind of broad range of topic, and so in some ways I'm making choices about things that we'll go into and what we won't go into. I will say that if there's things that people want to speak about, I'm very open to kind of have a conversation with you and sit down one-to-one if that feels much safer in a more detailed way. For some people, this includes the area of gender and those ideas of kind of dysphoria, gender fluidity. It involves all sorts of areas involving physiology, mental areas, a whole bunch of different ideas and understandings. It's a very complex area. For some, it covers the areas of sexuality, anywhere across the LGBTQI spectrum and all that entails. And it's all embedded in this idea of inclusion and exclusion as to who is welcome and not. And I know that for some there will be some feelings of disagreements or hurt or something in that particular space. There may be some things which require further conversation and clarification for some. For some of you, there might be unanswered questions. And I would just ask that you would, in a sense, bear with me. I would ask that you just kind of try to hang in as much as you can. All right? And if you have any questions, this is not kind of like the beginning and end of the conversation, if I can put it that way. And I also know that it's an area that comes with a lot of confusion and uncertainty. If I could say something, I want to speak specifically to any people who would fall under what sociologists would call Gen Z or Gen Alpha type people. That's really code for anybody essentially under the age of 25. And I would say, as I was laughing with one young person before our time tonight, they were saying, "Oh, you're going to speak to it from your age and your space." And that's right. I'm a 55-year-old cisgender white man. I cannot change any of that. That's who I am. I will be speaking from that stage, but I hope that I'll be able to share some insight which is not related to middle-aged white man syndrome. But if I was saying something to people tonight, it would be particularly to those who are under 25. Because I cannot imagine how difficult life at times feels for you. How problematic, how much of a struggle it is to navigate the world that you're in. From a distance, it looks like someone took all the lines on the roads of life and just wiped them out. Anything that's a guidepost, it looks to me like has been wiped out. And so for many of you, you view life over kind of this vast ocean without any posts, without any directions, and it's just a sea of uncertainty. And I just want to say that my heart is with you. I cannot imagine how difficult it is. I want to say that I know that this is a intensely personal topic. If this were an engineering class, it would be a lot simpler. We could discuss formulas, the strength of different materials, the validity of models. The issues might be complex, but because they were very little personal, no emotions or feelings attached, in some ways they're simple to do. But discussing sexuality and all that pertains around it is incredibly personal. And the reason is very simple, is that each one of us is a sexual being. A part of who we are, a part of how we feel about ourselves, is attached to that idea. Each one of us. That is a reality. It's intensely personal. Romantic relationships and views of sexuality are highly vulnerable. You probably know and understand this. When romantic relationships break up, we hurt. If you're a guy or a girl and have dared to ask someone out on a date, you know how on edge you feel. Discussing sexuality is incredibly personal. And not only in a sense about ourselves, but how we feel about others. In a book called The Engagement, which is kind of like an analysis of America's history with same-sex marriage, the journalist Sasha Eisenberg chronicles how the most recent court battles have been fought in the United States. Follows the evolution of the cause over the past 25 years. This particular person is a gay rights journalist, and he writes, he says, "We've seen across gay rights issues, not just marriage, that the best predictor of liberal attitudes has always been how somebody answers the question, do you have a friend, family member or co-worker who's gay or a lesbian?" That's incredibly personal. That question. Do you know someone in that space, whether it's yourself or someone else? And so when we answer that question, it's intensely related to who I am, whom I'm attached to, and how I feel about someone else. It would be much simpler to discuss these type of issues without personal feelings attached. But that simply doesn't exist. Most people know at least one and many others in this particular space. And I want to say that as I talk about what the kind of the emotions that are attached to it, I want to recognise that the understanding is for different generations a different type of experience. As someone laughingly said about myself, being a middle-aged man. Consider the catch-all LGBTQI expression. A Gallup survey in the United States in February 2021 concluded that 1 in 6 Americans aged 18 to 23 were fitting within that spectrum. But when they did further analysis of the particular surveys conducted amongst thousands and thousands of people, these were the following numbers that they came up with. So somebody who was essentially Gen X or older. So Gen X or older is essentially someone who is 50 plus, all right? The numbers in that space, 1 to 2%. For someone who is a millennial. Now, can people put their hand up if they think that they're a millennial here at the moment? Probably someone in the age between kind of late 20s to late 30s, you would qualify as a millennial. The survey materials that I have seen in that space, 7 to 10%. 7 to 10%. In the Gen Z space, so essentially someone kind of born in this century, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, the numbers range in this age group. It's hard to get completely accurate because of the age of some of them in this particular space, but somewhere between 25 and 40% identify in this LGBTQI spectrum. We all have different experiences of it, different awareness of this situation. So what I want to do tonight is I want to share about what I believe is a fundamental thought, which I hope will help bring about some understanding in this space. And then I'm actually going to dare, I think, to try to answer some black and white questions for a few minutes. I will not answer all of your questions. The first is I want to share a principle that I think is important to get some understanding where different people come from And for myself as a pastor of this church, I want to share with you what I believe is a biblical principle which guides all of the discussion. Here's the principle. Sex is nothing. Sex is everything. Sex is nothing. Sex is everything. I'm going to ask them to put a table up on the screen. Hopefully you can make sense of what this table says. There's a widespread view that the church should get out of bedrooms, stop trying to be moral police. But there is no doubt that a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, is in stark contrast to a secular worldview concerning sex. And here is the framework that I'm particularly talking about when it comes to the ideas and understanding of sex, both in terms of practice and an identity. There is a completely different way of looking at things in this space. Sex is everything. Sex is nothing. So when, for example, we talk about the physical practice of sex, the secular worldview tends to be this. Sexual activity is merely physical activity. Not dissimilar than any other physical activity that you may engage in. And so sexual partners, sexual practices, etc. are seen as no big deal. They are no more or no less meaningful than any other physical activity. And therefore, in some ways, there's no problem to have friends with benefits. Pornography is seen as widespread, but in many ways harmless fun. I might add, I'm not sure that if you're one of the millions of young women who are traded as sex slaves in the world think that way, but that is a general understanding of the nature of pornography. Why would you judge someone for their sexual behaviour? Because the physical nature of sex is a pleasurable activity to engage in, but means very little more than that. It's this idea that sexual practice, in a sense, means nothing. If I was putting it kind of like a hyperbole type way. In the contrast is a biblical view that sexual activity means everything or it's significant. The physical act of sex is important. It's meant to be enjoyable, exclusive, and valued. Expressions of it are to be treasured. Casual sex would be seen as a myth, an anathema. It doesn't make sense. In fact, the very description of sex in many parts of the Bible is described as to know someone. To know someone. I actually think that's a very powerful expression. To know someone. That's deep. Sex is seen as a place where you are more vulnerable, literally naked, than in any other place. But not just, of course, are you physically naked, you're also, in a sense, figuratively naked. You expose yourself more than in any other place in life. Biblically, sex is seen as almost a kind of a glorious mystery of two people becoming one flesh, of a union that is sometimes leads to the creation of new life, but that's actually, in a sense, ultimately not what it is about. The book of Genesis will describe it. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. The two are united into one. There is something unique, in a sense, that happens that joins them together. And Jesus himself places the highest value on sex. Adultery is not just having a physical affair, it's more than that. Don't even look at another woman. Why? Because to do so is, in a sense, is to break and to misunderstand that idea of two people joining together as one. Biblically, we would say that it's a radically diminished view of sex that kidnaps it from a place where it is meant to be enjoyed in the space of a covenant, a promise between two people. Strips it of its spiritual dimension. Sex is everything. Sex is nothing. Talking about the physical practice of sex. The second part, if I can ask you, Sam, to flip back to the table, the bottom of the table talks about identity and how sexuality is seen as part of identity. Because when I listen to and read and have conversations with people in our world today, when they talk about the significance of sexuality, it's not engaged in the conversation about practice, it's engaged in the area surrounding identity. Surrounding identity. And in this place, then, sex means everything. It's a key issue. It's the reason I also believe that there's so much sensitivity around this matter. Sexuality, and even to a degree gender identity, is a defining element. In fact, in many ways, at the core of the desire to validate same-sex marriage, for example, was the expression of an individual's value, their identity. In the survey that I noted before, the pollster wrote that he attributes the unusually high number he found in recent times to social and news media coverage that has made it for young Americans much easier to identify in the LGBTQI spectrum. This is a quote from it. Says, it's a subset of a larger issue, that this is a generation where 3 out of 4 people are searching for meaning. This is a group that doesn't have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. It's pretty harsh language, to be direct. But therefore, the LGBTQI identity gives them comfort. Sharita Gruberg, who is the Vice President of the LGBTQI Research and Communications Project, it's an area that is invested in this particular topic, and had been doing some research pointing to the progression of thinking and participation and action in the United States over the past 20 years. Discussed this and made this statement. She said, I can't stress enough what a difference that makes, as in the progress that in attitudes in America had been over the last 25 years, what a difference that makes in your comfort with your identity. And I must say, I find in the highlighting of sexuality as a fundamental, almost defining element of identity, that sexuality is the key to self-understanding, the key to your sense of value and worth in the world, somewhat problematic. When sexuality is what defines us, it also limits us, I believe. But this is a common understanding. It may be part of your understanding as you have lived in this world for the 20, 30 years of your life. Sex is everything. The contrast to this understanding of identity from a biblical perspective, in the sense, is sex is nothing. Because sex as an identity marker for people who are understanding a biblical view is not high. Identity is defined in different ways. Genesis 1 says, God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. Fundamentally, it recognises that for every single human being, identity should be found as being made in the image of God. Made in the image of God, as a child of God. So in a sense, identity is not defined by sexuality, so it means nothing. And in fact, the Bible in a whole variety of ways would go on to say that your identity is not defined by gender or sexuality. In Galatians 3 it talks about there's no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female, for you're all one in Jesus Christ. That's your identity. In 2 Corinthians 5 it says anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. That's identity. One author, a theologian by the name of Sam Albury, says this. He says, as a Christian, one of the key things for me is realising that identity as Christians is not something that we discover in ourselves, nor is it something we create. It's something we receive and are given by the only person who can know our actual identity, which is the God who made us. My identity as a Christian comes from the fact that I've been created by God, redeemed by Him, through the saving works of Jesus. This difference of understandings between the practice of sex, everything and nothing, and identity determined by sexuality, everything or nothing, leads us to a situation where it feels like to me like, from a biblical perspective, from a secular perspective, there is no common understanding in this space. In fact, I would say that the Christian prohibitions around marriage, sexuality, the very nature of humanity make no sense to most people because their belief that sexuality is crucial for the expression of identity, the very concept, the very understanding of the modern self. I think it's reasonable to say that in our culture, sex is no longer seen as a way to honour God in any way, shape or form. Most people believe like this: if you want to use sex for the development of new human life, that's an option, that's your choice, but it's not the primary reason people have sex. Rather, sex is for individual fulfillment, self-realisation. These ideas of expressive individualism, the ideas that are kind of deep within our feelings and desires that must be discovered and unlocked and expressed to become our true self. That's in contrast to what God has to say. Determining and acting on your sexual desires is considered a key part of that process of becoming an authentic person. So we have slogans such as, be true to yourself, live your own truth, repeated in all sorts of different ways, shapes and forms. So it's in no surprise that there would be conflict between a secular and a biblical worldview over this matter. And I would say that the principle here that I'm trying to espouse and share to you, which underlies all in my mind of the decision-making stuff, is that we need to take sexuality both more seriously and less seriously than the rest of society. These are genuine kind of bedrock principles which help us to understand what actually ends up as actions. And these types of questions and ideas, in fact, begin to ask even more questions about the very nature of relationships in our world. And so I put up a couple of draft questions. I think they're up there on the screen. So, for example, this question here: is celibacy cruel if romantic fulfillment is the meaning of life? So not just talking about sexuality, but also the part that, some people might choose to be celibate. It asks a different way of question. Here's another one. If we are eternal beings created by God, are we beyond sexuality? It's important that we kind of try to wrap our heads around. But I hope that you're able to see the clear principle that I'm trying to describe. I know it's not a simple thing just to grab quickly. That being said, I thought I would give some time after laying a base for our thinking to try to answer some direct questions. I want to do so cautiously acknowledging that everything I spoke about before with regards to sensitivity and where people are at, that's where I'd like to be, trying to be pastorally caring in how we speak. I'm not going to be addressing the issue of gender fluidity. It's an incredibly complex area, as I mentioned before. I believe that the reality of gender dysphoria for some people is very real, and know that there are genuine physiological indeterminate sexuality for some people in our world. If you'd like to speak to me, as I said, I'm available. You may have heard me mention before that I get incredibly frustrated when people give a 20-cent answer to a $1 million question. Some of these things are incredibly complex and difficult, and I can't answer them in just a 5-minute conversation. So here's some questions that were kind of put together. Andrew, what do you think would happen if a gay couple came into church holding hands? Well, my response to that is very simple. I hope that my response would be the same as it would be for any other couple, would be to extend a hand and welcome the people. I can say that in my life I've had a small number of same-sex friends, one school friend that became much more open after school, and a number of other people in some spaces, a few people. Probably far fewer than you might encounter in your life. I know that I and others do have blind spots and preconceptions. I hope that if some couple came into this church, that they would be welcomed. Andrew, if we welcome someone, does that mean that we believe their relationship is acceptable? Well, here's another way of changing that question. Do you see a difference between orientation and practice? Well, firstly, I want to say clearly I would announce and share that I do not see orientation as sinful in any way, shape or form. I'm oriented and tempted towards greed and lust. I don't necessarily think that is sinful. The quote that I mentioned before from a guy by the name of Sam Allberry is a quote from a practicing Christian who is very open that his orientation is same-sex attracted. And later on, if you're interested, I have a whole variety of resources that I could recommend to people. Some who are from very much practicing Christians who are same-sex attracted. So Andrew, let's get down to where the rubber hits the road. What about homosexual practice? Well, I would say to you, you may be familiar with there's 6 direct passages in the Bible that explicitly forbid same-sex practice. Some people have charmingly referred to these over the years as clobber passages because they have been used to bash people over the head. These are the passages. The Genesis passage that talks about sodomy with Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a very technical passage and difficult to interpret, and I would think that it has, to some degree, minimal application to Australia in the 21st century. Leviticus passages, there's 2 in Leviticus 18 and 20, I think, off the top of my head, which are with respect to holiness law. The question that is often asked in this situation is, why do we make a big deal about these practices regarding sexuality, but we don't make any issue about, what's about the commands forbidding eating shellfish or wearing textiles of different materials? I would say in some ways, very simply, there is a difference between parts which are called part of their moral code that was given to Israel in the ancient times, and also to what are often described as the ceremonial or temple laws, which were part of their Old Testament practices. There are also a couple of other passages in the New Testament which are more pertinent in regards to, in a passage in Romans, a passage in 1 Corinthians 6, and a passage in 1 Timothy. Regards to homosexual practice, you may be aware that Jesus does not speak directly about same-sex relationships. Now, that's a true statement. I would ask the question, is absence of evidence the same as evidence of absence? I.e., does Jesus' silence equate to acquiescence to the issue? What I would point to is that the reality is that Jesus in fact elevates the bar with regards to sexual practices. Sometimes Jesus is caricatured as some sort of prophet of free love, unconcerned about sexual ethics. But the reality is in fact that Jesus upped the ante from what was the practice of that day. On one particular occasion, he was asked by Pharisees who were trying to ensnare him in a discussion about, is it acceptable for someone to be divorced? And Jesus said that he recognised that divorce happened at that time, but in fact what he did was up the ante as to why it would be. Men at that time had the ability to divorce someone simply because they no longer felt it was suitable for them to be married to that person. Jesus essentially outlawed that. He definitely upped the ante with regards to all sexual practices. And in the doing so, reaffirmed God's creation and the creative order of male and female in a marriage. In fact, the early church, it would be clear to say, understood this teaching and both practiced it, and it was part of their teaching. In fact, the early church was one of the key social influences on its day, a radical influence in Roman society. Roman society was incredibly open. It had inherited part of the Greco-Roman ethics of its day. It was such that sexual liberation was a normative part of life. A man, and this very much is a very sexist type situation, very much a part of the patriarchal society of that day, a man was expected to be able to have free sexual license with almost anyone. Your slave, your housemaid, young boys, it was the norm in society. The only people out of bounds were the wife of another citizen. Women were expected to be virgins until married. I'm not sure how, considering all the other factors, but I suppose it was part of being an acceptable person in their society. They were expected to stay faithful, and I do easily see the double standard. The church was a radical influence because it not only taught faithfulness, but it gave equality in relationships. In fact, you can read in parts of the New Testament the teaching of that day, which says things like this: that a man's body is for his wife as the wife's body is for her husband. And that might not sound much to our ears now, but in the first century that was a radical, radical thought. That a man's body was only for his wife. I can do whatever I want. That was the pervasive idea. Jesus' teaching, in fact, turned on its head most of the thinking of that society. Here's another question that I've got. Andrew, why do we make a big issue of sexual practice when the Bible talks so little about same-sex and far more about areas like greed, etc.? And I would say it's a very good point. I agree. At times I think the church has made it too much of an issue. Sometimes it's needed to take the speck out of its own eye before it took the log out of others. And I'd also say that society has made it a massive issue today with regards to identity. Here's another question. Andrew, the science is in. God has made me this way. It must be right. Now this will bring a smile to my children if they're ever listening to this particular talk. There's a song by Lady Gaga called Born This Way. Do you like that pop culture reference? That's impressive, isn't it? Here's a couple of lines from the song. I got to say that we have kind of this joke in my family because I used to like to think that I was up to date with pop culture. When I work with young people, I try to keep up with it. My kids asked me the other day, there was a bunch of people on the screen, they said, "Could you identify Beyonce?" And the answer was no. Isn't that embarrassing? Here's part of the song. I'm beautiful in my way. I can't do it like the kind of rap version of the song that it is. All right? Because, no, I can't. I can't. Maybe someone else can get up here and do it. I'm beautiful in my own way because God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. A couple of items I want to mention. I'm not a scientist, but I've tried to read some of the science stuff. Been a variety of studies that have been done in recent years investigating this area. Particularly scientific studies always try to follow twins. I can't imagine what it's like being a twin. You must feel like you're always invited to be part of one of these studies. I suppose it gives kind of, like the whole control group and all that sort of stuff. But studies have been done following paternal and fraternal twins trying to answer this question. Is sexual desire an element of nature, a genetic item, or alternatively a nurture item? In every study that I've ever seen to be able to read the outcomes are inconclusive. The variations seem to be too great to have any real sense of clarity around them. The second part of science study that I want to share with you is there is a common thinking that surrounds, in a very simplistic way, that sexuality is either 100% homosexual or 100% heterosexual. Here's a little beautiful graph that I put there up on the screen for you. Isn't that incredibly detailed? The reality is that when large surveys of people have taken place, the vast majority of people who answer these questions and are questions about what their sexual thoughts and understandings have been, it is only a small group of people, a very limited number of people, that report exclusive homosexual thoughts or exclusive heterosexual thoughts. The vast majority do not exist at the 100% on either end of that spectrum. The conclusion that I've read from a number of different scientific things that it's a combination of factors. Orientation, environment, choice ends up to a degree determining practice. The science results that I've tried to peruse indicate that any attempts to prove sexuality on a scientific basis is inconclusive. Here's another question I've got. Andrew, why shouldn't I just hook up with someone? I want to know who wrote these questions. As a precursor to this question, let me say this. I remember a guy who was involved with Luther College, where my daughters go to school, a guy by the name of Paul Dillon, giving a talk about drug and alcohol use amongst senior high school students. And as he was doing this talk, he indicated that approximately 10 to 15% had either used drugs or alcohol to excess amongst senior high students on at least kind of one occasion. Or as he described it, interestingly, he didn't say it's not just 10 to 15%, he flipped it around and he said, what that really means is that 85 to 90% don't. A large survey in excess of 25,000 people was conducted among American university students approximately 5 years ago. So these are students who are about approximately 21 years of age. A sociologist by the name of Michael Kimmel asked male university students across the United States what proportion of their classmates they believe had had sex on any given weekend. The average answer they gave was about 80%. So the 21-year-olds thought that about 80% of their mates had had sex on the previous weekend. In fact, according to this survey, a cross-campus study of all these students, 80% was the proportion of final year students who had ever had sex. The number on a particular weekend, 5 to 10%. I just want people to hear that the reality is often a long way from the fantasy. So should I involve with just hooking up with someone? Well, I've got to say I just touched on some of the aspects earlier on, because I would want to share with you that sex is much more than just a physical activity. The choices in some ways that you make, your understandings, will determine your actions, how you place and what the value is you place on sex. In Ephesians 5, it talks about it this way. It says, a man leaves his father and mother, joined to his wife, the two are united in one. So that's quoting the Genesis 1 passage. He says this is a great mystery, but it is an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one. It's a great mystery of how Christ and the church are one. What's that mystery? It's saying that there's no intimacy with God without entering into a covenant, a promise with Him. And so to have sexual intimacy without entering into an exclusive permanent arrangement is anathema to it. It doesn't fit. It misses the joy of a sexual relationship. Now, modern culture has turned sexual relationships into consumerist, transactional relationships. Consumerist relationships are all about what can I get? My self-fulfillment. My needs are the non-negotiables. They're more important than the relationship. A covenant, on the other hand, is a relationship of mutual self-giving, of putting the needs of the other party and the good of relationship before your own. In fact, Paul goes on to argue it this way. He says in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, the person who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. He says that this is the mystery of being Christ in us. That the Spirit of God, in a sense, indwells us. We are joined to God, he's saying. And immediately afterwards, he says this, run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. Not in a sense because one sin is worse than the other. No, he says sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. Your own body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you. He says it makes no sense to join with someone else in this space in a non-covenantal relationship after we've joined with God in a covenantal relationship. Our union with Christ is something more, something of higher value. Should I hook up or not? I think my suggestion is understand or think about what you think is involved in the very nature of sex. The last question I've got is, Andrew, does God or just my church hate my friends? And that's a incredibly long, deep thing, because whenever hate is involved, and I talked about before about the personal nature of much of these things. If God is love, how can hate be there? It's too simplistic to talk about hate the sin, love the sinner. Does being gay, trans or asexual mean I cannot be a Christian? That's something that if someone wanted to speak about, I'd rather talk about it in a longer one-to-one kind of occasion. What I would do is I would read out Galatians 3, which says, there's no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female. You're all one in Christ Jesus. Jesus, the one who opened his arms wide to every single person. And I believe that it's only in knowing Jesus do we truly find a place where we can understand hope, meaning and love. It doesn't give answers for all that, but it's what I can do in this time that I have. I do want to mention that before we finish up, that I have access to a large variety of resources. I'm willing and able to recommend a whole variety of different, whether they're books or articles. Some of them are more personal stories from people. Some of them are more intensely academic. I have listened to two Christian scholars. One is a guy by the name of Wesley Hill, who would describe himself as celibate, gay and Christian. He writes a book called Washed and Waiting, in which he explores what it means to live as a faithful Christian with same-sex attraction. Another guy by the name of Sam Aubrey, who also has said that the only romantic thoughts in his life that he's ever had are towards men. He's written a number of books, including one of them is God, Anti-Gay, a whole variety of other things. And if you would like to get any of those details from me, I'm very happy to do so. Now, it's my prayer that firstly that you would be able to see and understand tonight some of what I believe are more the significant Christian principles regarding sexuality. I hope that you will see that they are principles that recognise the value of each person, that honour them as God has made them, that reminds each one of us of our intrinsic identity as made in the image of God. And I also pray that you'll hear the invite to journey with you. Sexuality and all that it surrounds it, physical practice, identity, are not simple matters. There's a reason why adolescence is a struggle for every single human. If you're in that space, you probably feel like no one else understands what I'm going through. Can you please at least try to hear me? Every teenager ever has felt that way. And I want to invite you to journey along with us. We don't have any quick answers, but I hope that we can love and walk alongside you. Let me pray. Our God, we thank you that you have made us the way we are. Made each one of us in your image. Made each one of us valuable. And we know that living in this world, the 21st century, is at times a struggle and a confusing time. In many ways the same as it has been through every century. But our current time has new challenges for all. Father, we know that among us today and among our networks of friends, there'll be many people who are struggling and wrestling with these issues. Father, first of all, help us to take them intensely seriously. to honour, respect and love all who find themselves particularly in that space. Father, I pray that above all, that we would be transformed by your love in this space and our understanding of who you are and what you've done for us. Father, I pray for those who have particular struggles, that they would be able to find the people to walk alongside, to ask questions, to know that they're invited to do so. God, I pray for each one, particularly for those who are younger tonight, who are wrestling with